Who is the most interesting poet you've never heard of? Naturally, not having heard of this person, you wouldn't know. But allow me to offer a possible answer. John G. Neihardt. It's likely that if you have heard this name, you know him as the author of Black Elk Speaks. In this best-selling ethnography, Neihardt records a series of conversations he had with Lakota medicine man Black Elk, a cousin of Crazy Horse who fought at the Battle of Little Bighorn, participated in the Ghost Dance movement of the 1880s, and survived the Wounded Knee Massacre. It's a fascinating book that deserves its status as a classic. But Black Elk Speaks only came about as a side project for an epic poem Neihardt was researching about the closing of the western frontier and the conflict between Native Americans and white settlers. And while the ethnography has gone on to sell more than 1 million copies, Neihardt's epic has been half forgotten. I think it deserves to be better known, and so I want to spend some time talking about this poem and Neihardt more generally. So who is John G. Neihardt? My personal love affair with Neihardt's work began last year. I was researching Hugh Glass for a piece I was writing in American Essence magazine, Hugh Glass being the famous fur trapper who survived a vicious bear attack and crawled back to civilization. And while doing this, I learned that someone wrote an epic poem about him more than a century ago. This poem, it turns out, formed the distant basis for Michael Punke's best-selling novel The Revenant, and its subsequent film adaptation starring Leonardo DiCaprio. As someone writing a long epic myself, I was intrigued by this discovery. I try to read as many examples of the genre as I can, so I decided to check out the Song of Hugh Glass. I was initially expecting it to be one of these mediocre epics that litters the literary landscape. There have been many subpar epics that have been written in history, and since I had never heard of this, I thought this would be much the same. And I was actually pleasantly surprised by what I found. Not only was the Song of Hugh Glass not mediocre, it was quite good. It was not the product of some amateurish poet who just decided to write an epic. The literary quality is much more highbrow than Punke's novel, in fact. I then looked up the author, John G. Neihardt, a poet I had never heard of. Who was this minor literary figure, I wondered? Well, he turned out to be a Midwesterner like myself, a longtime resident of my home state of Missouri. And finally, my surprise grew to shock when I learned that he served as Nebraska's poet laureate for 52 years. Neihardt's tenure exceeds even that of England's Alfred Lord Tennyson, who happened to be Neihardt's literary hero. Tennyson served for 42 years. When Nebraska's state legislature appointed Neihardt to this position in 1921, no other U.S. state yet had a poet laureate, and the Library of Congress would not name its first consultant in poetry for another 16 years, the office now known as U.S. Poet Laureate. This makes John Neihardt both America's first official poet laureate and the longest-serving poet laureate in the history of the world, as far as I know. And in his day, the Song of Hugh Glass did sell a good number of copies. The sales of Hugh Glass paid for all his coal in the winter of 1915-16. So he put those sales to good use. Though he was already a widely published and nationally known writer for his poetry collections, nonfiction, short stories, and novels, his epic catapulted him to further success. In his later life, he would go on speaking tours, giving public readings to large crowds. He became so celebrated as a poet of the West that Nebraska and Missouri each fought to claim him as their own, offering salaried positions at newspapers and colleges if he would agree to relocate. Missouri, the state where ironically he moved shortly before being named Nebraska's poet laureate, naturally wanted him to stay, and he eventually joined the University of Missouri's faculty. Shortly before his death at age 92, he appeared on the Dick Cavett Show. Reflecting on his interview with Neihardt decades later, Cavett recalled that, "For years to come, I'd be told he was the most wonderful guest I ever had." So all of this raises the question, what happened How did Neihardt go from being one of America's biggest literary celebrities to an obscure figure now known mostly only to academic specialists? And the short answer is because he opposed the free verse trend known as modernism that became fashionable when he was writing, and has remained dominant down to our own day. Critics of Neihardt's work, including the highly influential Ezra Pound, were scathing about his old-fashioned use of rhymed iambic pentameter. And as a Midwesterner on the frontier of the literary avant-garde that centered in New York, Neihardt was also a geographical outsider. The JSTOR database lists a little more than 500 articles either about him or that mention him. I think most of these articles seem to be about Black Elk Speaks, but some are about his epic, although almost all of the ones that are date to his own lifetime and not after. One reviewer of the time compared him with John Masefield, actually, who was Poet Laureate of Britain for 37 years, almost as long as Tennyson. Now, Neihardt's achievements as an epic poet don't rest just on Hugh Glass. This was only the first in a series of 5 epic poems Neihardt wrote, and they're all different stories with different characters, but they do share a common theme. They're epic in the traditional sense of that term. They feature legendary, larger-than-life figures. Neihardt grouped the poems together in a collection published as The Cycle of the West. It begins in 1822 with the first fur trappers and ends in 1890 with the Wounded Knee Massacre and the closing of the frontier. He began Cycle of the West when he was about 30 and finished it at 60, so it took him 3 decades to write, and if you consider it as a single work as opposed to 5 separate works, this poem cycle is almost the longest poem in American literature, the longest being Herman Melville's Clarel at 18,000 lines. And Cycle of the West falls a little short of that at around 17,000 lines. Personally, I think it's better than Melville's poem, both in that the poetry is better and it's a more entertaining story. Not that Clarel is bad or anything, it's pretty good, if kind of boring. I also think it's better than John Brown's Body, which I consider kind of a grade B epic. It is uneven and sloppy in places, full of Whitman-esque rambling. Stephen Vincent Benet slips into prose to narrate his battle scenes, for example, which is kind of just cheating. If you're going to write a poem, write a poem. So this is a long episode, longer than any I've ever done, and that's because I'm going to focus on each of Neihardt's 5 epics, and I'm going to do some analyses, and I'm going to do some readings from each of those. But first I wanted to delve a little more into Neihardt's life, and ask how this person from Missouri in the middle of nowhere came to be a celebrated epic poet. Modern epic poets arise largely by accident, and spend their careers struggling against prevailing trends. Neihardt's life reflects this, but he was also born in a time and place more favorable to epics than our own. In talking about his life, I'm largely drawing on Timothy Anderson's biography, Lonesome Dreamer, The Life of John G. Neihardt, which was published by University of Nebraska Press in 2016. He spent his childhood in a sod house in western Kansas, living with his grandparents who had moved out there in a covered wagon. He was descended of frontier people. This deeply impacted him. He would always remember a terrifying experience he had one night when a prairie fire swept across the plains and almost burned down their farm. So when Neihardt is telling this story, this epic about the frontier, it's really his story, and a story about people he knew. Especially in the last 2 volumes about the Indian Wars, Neihardt directly conversed with people like Black Elk, who were involved in the events he describes. In the earlier volumes, though he did largely rely on journals and knowledge of Western history, he did know some very old frontiersmen who knew about these things firsthand, and even knew some of the major figures quite well. For example, he knew an old plainsman who was a close friend of Jim Bridger, one of the legendary mountain men. As Neihardt said, such intimate contacts with soldiers, plainsmen, Indians, and rivermen were an integral part of my life for many years. And about his choice of poetic subject matter, he said, I did not experience the necessity of seeking material about which to write. The feel and mood of it were in the blood of my family, and my early experiences aroused a passionate awareness of it. My family came to Pennsylvania more than a generation before the Revolutionary War, in which 14 of us fought, and crossing the Alleghenies after the war, we did not cease pioneering until some of us reached Oregon. If I write of hot winds and grasshoppers, of prairie fires and blizzards, of dawns and noons and sunsets and nights, of brooding heat and thunderstorms in vast lands, I knew them early. They were the vital facts of my world, along with the talk of the old-timers who knew such fascinating things to talk about. And in this sense, Neihardt's epic is unique. In fact, I've never read a modern epic poem quite like A Cycle of the West. It's different from pretty much every other secondary epic I've read. For the record, secondary epic being an epic that is written and meant to be read, and primary epic being an epic arising from oral tradition meant to be recited and heard. Neihardt has been called the American Homer. This is accurate in more ways than one. In some ways, A Cycle of the West is kind of halfway in between a primary epic like the Iliad and secondary epics by Virgil or Apollonius or Milton, who are all epic authors rooted in book learning. Now, there is a lot of book learning sprinkled in throughout A Cycle of the West. Neihardt was a bookish guy himself, and there's a lot of classical allusions to things. Now, take this passage from the opening chapter of The Song of Three Friends, the second of the 5 epics Neihardt wrote. Their hulks have found the harbor ways that know the ships of all the sagas long ago, a moony haven where no loud gale stirs. The trappers and the singing voyagers are comrades now of Jason and his crew, foregathered in that timeless rendezvous where come at last all seekers of the fleece. So here we have a likening to the ships of the Viking sagas, and then the trappers are compared to Jason and his crew, hunting for beaver pelts like seekers of the fleece, which I think is a very apt simile, as is the comparison to the Icelandic sagas, which have a lot in common with the theme of westward expansion. In the next chapter, the hard-boiled river boatman Mike Fink is described as a pantagruelizing wight, and many a blowsy Ariadne pines for him. So you see here there are imaginative references to other authors, to classical mythology, and history more generally. But it's not a dense network of references like you find in Milton. And then again, there is this indirect oral element. He's adding details he directly heard from native warriors and illiterate old frontiersmen. So the poem is linguistically sophisticated in the way that Homer is sophisticated. That is, Neihardt is just a good writer, a great metaphor maker, a good storyteller, without for the most part being difficult to understand. And as far as the, classical allusions and stuff go, the annotations for the Bison Classics edition of Cycle of the West are nice and helpful, but footnotes aren't essential in grasping the essence of the poem in the same way that they're essential for Paradise Lost. Now, obviously, Cycle of the West is very unlike the Iliad because it lacks the repetitive phrases of an oral epic, and Homer didn't interview Achilles or Odysseus. The Trojan War happened centuries before Homer was born. So in some ways, A Cycle of the West is actually not really like any notable epic poem that's been written. In fact, if there is a work I would compare it to, it's not an epic poem, but the histories of Herodotus. Herodotus, like Neihardt, did ethnographic research. He got a lot of his information by talking to very old people who knew the participants in the Persian Wars that had ended half a century before he was writing. Now, in some ways, A Cycle of the West is very much like a secondary epic in its literary structure and self-consciousness. I already mentioned the elusiveness to classical literature. The poems are written in heroic couplets, that is, rhymed couplets in iambic pentameter, a form that was really popularized by John Dryden and Alexander Pope. Unlike those poets, though, Neihardt's lines are often enjambed rather than employing a full stop at the end of each couplet. His sentences are often long and sinuous. Another stylistically interesting innovation is that he'll close a stanza with only the first line of the couplet and pick up the next stanza with the concluding line. Or he'll even split up a line concluding a stanza with the first half of the line and picking up the next stanza with the second half of the line. And he also does this at the level of the chapter as well, pushing you along, wanting you to read more. Another thing he does is take Homeric similes and adapt them to the American frontier. So instead of a lioness protecting her cub, it's a grizzly bear protecting her cub. An interesting twist that harkens back to the epic tradition while doing something new, rooting it in his geography. He'll also juxtapose grandiose descriptions with characters speaking in dialect, and there's a Shakespearean quality here to Neihardt's poetry in that respect. It is a serious poem, it tends to be dark and tragic, and so he rarely uses feminine endings. He also rarely departs from the meter, and employs contractions to this effect, which of all the things he does is probably the most archaic. So back to Neihardt's life. His mother worked as a dressmaker, working 10 hours a day for $1 a day. He himself acquired copies of Idylls of the King and Robert Browning's selected poems, and took them everywhere, recited them, weeding beats with them in his pocket. Despite being just a kid from the boonies, he showed great intellectual talent. He entered Nebraska Normal College at age 13 and graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree when he was 15, paying off his expensive tuition by working as the school bell ringer. He received an excellent education in the Greek and Roman classics. Though this did not prepare him in any way for a career in John Dewey's America, it did lay the groundwork of knowledge for his eventual epic. When he was 14, he had his first poem published in the local newspaper. After graduating, he couldn't afford to continue his education at the University of Nebraska, so he got a series of odd jobs, worked in beet fields as a store clerk, as a journalist, even learning the art of begging for food from hobos. In his 20s, he built a boat and traversed the Missouri River. He then lived in northern Nebraska at the edge of the retreating frontier and became acquainted with the Omaha Indians, later also with the Oglala Sioux, which is evident in Black Elk Speaks. And his connection with real tribesmen and old warriors is crucial because he writes about Native Americans in a much more realistic way than, say, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow did, who lived in New England and had a very comfortable life and probably never talked with any real Indians. I do like Longfellow, but I think the Song of Hiawatha is maybe the worst thing he wrote. It's just sentimental balderdash, which probably is why it was so beloved for such a long time. Now, Neihart's early volumes do have some sentimental touches. The Song of Three Friends, which, as I said, is the second of his epics, but chronologically the first, is most like this. I personally don't think Neihardt overdoes this. The sentimentality never approaches an excessively maudlin, gushing, throw-up-in-your-mouth character. It's not hard sentimentality, it's more what you might call the soft sentimentality of just having a lot of very charming, wonderful descriptions. Here's an example of one from the Song of Three Friends in the chapter The Upstream Men. That night was calm and clear, just such a night as when the waning year has set aflare the old Missouri wood, when greenings are beginning to be good, and when, so hollow is the frosty hush, one hears the ripe persimmons falling, plush, upon the littered leaves. The kindly time, with cider in the vigor of its prime, just strong enough to edge the dullest wit, should neighbor folk drop in a while to sit and gossip. Oh, the dear flame-painted gloam! The backlogs sputter on the hearth at home. How far away that night! Thus many a lad, grown strangely old, remembered, and was sad. Wolves mourned among the bluffs. Like hanks of wool, fog flecked the river, and the moon was full. Personally, I think this is a lovely description of the Missouri countryside. The Song of Three Friends, and really all of the volumes, are full of very picturesque descriptions like this. I don't think there's anything wrong with this sort of, as you might call it, soft sentimentality, as long as it's carefully controlled. I'm going to read one more passage from this volume, and this one is not a nature description. It is a scene of fur trappers entertaining themselves around a campfire, from the chapter The Shooting of the Cup. The day was spent in sorting out the furs, with eager talk of how the winter went, and with the growing night grew merriment. The hump and haunches of a bison cow hung roasting at the heaped-up embers now on Henry's hearth. The backlog whined and popped, and sitting squat or lounging elbow-propped, shrewd traders in the merchandise of tales held traffic, grandly careless how the scales tip-tilted with a slight excessive weight. And when the roast was finished, how they ate! And there was that which set them singing too against the deep bass music of the flute, while catgut screamed ecstatic in the lead, encouraging the voices used and keyed to vast and windy spaces. Later came a gentler mood when, staring at the flame, men ventured reminiscences and spoke about Kentucky people, or the folk back yonder in Virginia, or the ways they knew in old St. Louis, till the blaze fell blue upon the hearth, and in the gloom and melancholy stillness of the room they heard the wind of midnight wail outside. There's some great little details here, describing stringing a fiddle as screaming catgut, the alliteration, the hump and haunches of a bison cow hung, roasting at the heaped up embers now on Henry's hearth. You'll notice that he only alliterates twice in each line. So he doesn't overdo it, it's skillfully controlled. So again, it's very charming verse. Of course, modernists, and even more so postmodernists, hate picturesqueness. They hate charm, they want everything to be jarring and ugly, so naturally, they really hate this kind of stuff. And are consequently, I think, really unable to distinguish hard from soft sentimentality. They just lump the two together and condemn them both, as did a reviewer in Poetry magazine during Neihardt's lifetime. Another criticism of Neihardt's work that I encountered is that it isn't quotable, and this is because his sentences on average are just so long. And it's true that he's not quotable in the punchy, Twitter-esque way that is common in our generation. His heroic couplets are enjammed a lot and tend to run on. If they were more full-stopped aphorisms in the Popian sense, I'm sure they would be more quotable. But I think these passages that I read exemplify how, if he's not exactly quotable, he is very recitable. His lines flow so well, they're very pleasurable to listen to. And I think Neihardt really fulfills those two essential qualities of great literature. He instructs and he entertains. One minor criticism I have of Neihardt's work is that when he writes dialect, sometimes it goes on for a while and it's difficult to follow because it's so thick. I was kind of reminded of those long passages in Bram Stoker's Dracula, where he has like a character speaking in dialect and it really just goes on for way too long. And you just are inclined to just skip over that part when you're reading Dracula. And so I think that dialect writing is better done the way that Toni Morrison does it. That is, she sprinkles it in here and there. There's just a word or two in every sentence that gives the flavor of the dialect, so it's more readable. Whereas in Neihardt's dialect writing, not always, but sometimes, every word is dialect, which is more accurate and realistic. I mean, it's how these people talked, but it's less digestible. Also, there are occasional syntactical inversions to fit the rhyme scheme and contractions to fit the meter, all things that were standard in Alexander Pope's day, but by this time had become unfashionable. Neihardt does do this less in later volumes, though. The later volumes are less sentimental, but also less unified. This reflects not only his development as a poet, but his shift in method. The earlier volumes rely on journals and books more, while the later volumes rely more on primary oral accounts. Now, there is something else about this poem cycle that is deeply unsentimental. The subject matter is thoroughly masculine. These are poems about men forging a path in the wilderness, about Indian braves fighting to the death to preserve their way of life. Neihardt wrote that the trappers and warriors of this time were the direct descendants in the epic line of all the heroes that have been celebrated in song and saga. And this, his story, was the final link in that long chain of heroic periods, stretching from the region of the Euphrates eastward into India and westward to our own Pacific coast. So, while there are a lot of charming descriptions, there is also a lot of brutality. These poems are very hard-boiled in their subject matter. The Song of Three Friends is least like this, and I think it's the weakest of the 5 poems. Not for any presumed sentimentality, but just because the story is, I think, a little more boring than the other volumes. It's about these 3 frontiersmen who are just not as well known as Hugh Glass or Jim Bridger, and so the subject itself is just more obscure. It's not as good as his first epic, The Song of Hugh Glass, which, again, has these very hard-boiled and brutal aspects. Now, unlike in the film The Revenant, the poem doesn't directly narrate the bear attack from the perspective of the main character. We see things from the perspective of the fur trapper, Jim Bridger, known as Jamie in the poem. And here is the description of the bear attack. Then, starting as a voice beneath a shroud, a muffled boom woke somewhere up the stream, and like vague thunder hearkened in a dream, drawled back to silence. Now, with heart abound, keen for the quarter of the perished sound, the lad spurred gaily, for he doubted not his cry had brought Hugh's answering rifle shot. The laggard air was like a voice that sang, and Jamie half believed he sniffed the tang of wood smoke and the smell of flesh a roast, when presently before him, like a ghost, upstanding, huge in twilight, arms flung wide, a grey form loomed. The wise horse reared and shied, snorting his inborn terror of the bear. And in the whirlwind of a moment there, betwixt the brute's hoarse challenge and the charge, the lad beheld upon the grassy marge of a small spring that Bulberries stooped to scan, a ragged heap that should have been a man, a huddled broken thing, and it was Hugh. So the word bear doesn't even occur until 14 lines into the passage, and we only find out fully what happened at the end when Hugh's body is lying there in a ragged heap. Neihardt will often narrate events in an indirect way like this, from the perspective of an observer who's seen things secondhand and is trying to piece things together. Mike Fink's death scene in Song of Three Friends also occurs in this way. And this is a realistic approach often to people on the ground. Events that seem straightforward from a bird's eye perspective are often very confusing as they're happening. However, I did find myself wishing that Neihardt had just directly narrated the events of what happened in the bear attack, because it would just be way more entertaining. I was really hungering for a play-by-play poetic rendition of that brutal action scene in the Revenant film where Leonardo is just getting viciously mauled, because the scene in the movie is both very hard to watch and captivating at the same time, like you're horrified but you just can't look away. But I do understand why Neihardt narrates events in this way. Hugh Glass did not leave a first-hand account of his experiences. He didn't write anything, and so many legends grew up around him. Nobody knows exactly what happened, and even in Neihardt's later volumes about the Indian Wars, with his ethnographic methods of research, he's talking to so many people, and, they all have slightly different perspectives. And sometimes he'd have to choose between these different perspectives in how he narrates an event, especially when it might contradict a textbook account. So, back to the Song of Hugh Glass. Hugh is mauled, he seems like he's going to die, and the other trappers in the expedition are deciding what to do. But when at noon he had not ceased to moan, and fought still like the strong man he had been, there grew a vague mistrust that he might win, and all this be a tale for wondering ears. So Major Henry called for volunteers, 2 men among the 80 who would stay to wait on Glass and keep the wolves away, until he did whatever he should do. All quite agreed 'twas bitter bread for Hugh, yet none, save Jamie, felt in duty bound to run the risk, until the hat went round, and pity wakened at the silver's clink, in Jules Le Bon. He would not have them think that mercenary motives prompted him. So here we are introduced to the antagonist of the story, one of the trappers, a character named Jules Le Bon, who is a fictionalized version of the historical trapper John S. Fitzgerald. We're told he's yielding to mercenary motives while he's playing on Jim Bridger's grief, faking concern, and with the silver clink we have a Judas reference. Now, as one of the footnotes tells us, helpfully, this name, Jules Le Bon, is ironic. In French, Jules means youthful, suggesting that his decisions are immature even though he's older than the Jamie character. And Le Bon means the good, a meaning that belies Le Bon's callous treatment of Hugh. So Le Bon leaves Hugh behind, Hugh has to crawl back to civilization and decides to take vengeance on those who abandoned him. Now, this revenge theme does not occur in the historical account. This is Neihardt's contribution to the story. And Jules Le Bon is not some caricatured arch-villain. He's given realistic motives, and he does wrestle with his conscience via internal monologue about whether to leave Hugh Glass behind or not. We're told, night fell. At sundown, day-long winds are like to veer. So, summoning a mood of relished fear, Le Bon remembered dire alarms by night. The swoop of savage hordes, the desperate fight of men outnumbered, and, like him of old, in all that made Jules shudder as he told, his the great part, a man by field and flood, fate-tossed. So this unnamed him of old is actually a reference to Virgil's Aeneid, where Hector appears to Aeneas in a dream in Book 2 as Troy is about to fall. And there's this almost pathetic parallel between Laban and Aeneas, a man by field and flood, fate-tossed. Because, as the Trojans were beset by the Greeks and Aeneas had to escape, so the trappers are beset by Indians, a tribe called the Rhees, or the Arikara people, who the trappers had previously fought. The Rhees are tracking them as these events are unfolding, so Laban has to decide whether to stay or go. And I call the parallel with Aeneas pathetic because Aeneas was a man bound by destiny to found Rome, and Laban is really at heart a coward driven by fear and greed. But isn't that always how such people rationalize their base actions? Like when Raskolnikov commits murder in Crime and Punishment, he's comparing himself with Napoleon and Julius Caesar, but really he's just a common criminal. So with Laban, it's the same kind of thing. But anyway, already here we have a reference to the Aeneid, and we also have biblical references. And we can see in just a few brief passages just how highbrow Neihardt's epic is. There's a parallel drawn between Hugh Glass and Jacob from the book of Genesis. We're told that the stubborn fighter would not die, but grappled with the angel. And earlier we are told, for though the greybeard fought with sobbing breath, no man, it seemed, might break upon the hip so stern a wrestler with the strangling grip that made the neck veins like a purple thong tangled with knots. So Hugh, like Jacob, has been wounded in the leg grappling with the angel or the bear. And we are told later in the second chapter, again he woke, and with a drowsy doubt, remote unto his horizontal gaze, he saw the world's end kindle to a blaze, and up the smoky steep pale heralds run. And when at length he knew it for the sun, dawn found the darkling reaches of his mind, where in the twilight he began to find strewn shards and torsos of familiar things. As from the rubble in a place of kings, men school the dream to build the past anew, so out of dream and fragment builded Hugh, and came upon the reason of his plight, the bear's attack, the shot, and then the night wherein men talked as ghosts above a grave. Some consciousness of will the memory gave. He would get up. The painful effort spent made the wide heavens billow as a tent, wind struck. The shaken prairie sag and roll. Some moments with an effort at control he swayed, half raised upon his arms, until the dizzy cosmos righted, and was still. Then would he stand erect and be again the man he was. So Hugh Glass will not be defeated. He is struggling to rise with the dawn. And again, just have to note the grandiose allusions here. In this case, to the kings who, from the rubble of dreams, are building the past anew. And you might yourself be stopping to think in all this, were these folksy backwater people actually comparing themselves to the kings of old as they're struggling to survive in the wilderness?
Tell you about them sobbing women who lived in the Roman days.
Well, no, but this is epic, and this is kind of a convention in epic, and everything just has to be very grandiose. But in one sense, it might be a little more plausible than you think. We as modern people are often very arrogant in assuming how much better we are, how much more knowledgeable, how much smarter than we were than people of the past. But if you've ever browsed a McGuffey reader and seen how highbrow its contents are, you would be much less keen on praising yourself in this regard. In fact, if anything, I think your attitude should be one of humility when you realize how grade school level kids in one-room rural schoolhouses who were reading Shakespeare and the Romantic poets actually had a much higher degree of literary culture than almost every American adult does today. So don't count out Hugh Glass or Jules Le Bon for their highbrow references, because even though many of them technically couldn't read, a lot of these stories were more commonly known than they are today. And as I mentioned already, Neihardt himself, a kid who grew up in a sod house, was also the product of this 19th century educational system that emphasized classical learning. And I really feel like this low-key erudite aspect of pre-modern life doesn't really come through when modern novelists portray the period, because they're writing about it from their modern perspective and their modern pragmatically driven literacy levels. And this is nowhere more evident than the best-selling novel, The Revenant, which became the direct inspiration for the film. He begins with the sentence, "They were abandoning him." The wounded man knew it when he looked at the boy, who looked down, then away, unwilling to hold his gaze. Now, not that this is bad or anything, it's perfectly fine. The book is entertaining. It's just one of these minimalistic novels that's largely devoid of any interesting language or metaphors. Basically a story written for an audience of screen starers, and pretty much everybody who's reading it now is reading it because they saw the movie version and they're curious and they want to know more. Just comparing this passage with the selected passages from the Song of Hugh Glass, you can see how vastly superior the literary quality of Neihardt's poem is to Michael Punke's novel. And I think it's a tragedy that Neihardt's poem has been almost completely forgotten, while Punke's novel has sold like 1 million copies and made its author famous. And wouldn't you note, Michael Punke has clumsily trudged in Neihardt's footsteps yet again by writing a novel about Crazy Horse. The big difference between the Song of Hugh Glass and the later novelization and movie version is that in Neihardt's version of the story, when Hugh makes it back, he is about to take revenge on Jules Le Bon, and then he doesn't. The chapter Return of the Ghost has him about to shoot Jules. The old man set the trigger of his gun and gazed on Jules, who cowered by the wall. Eyes blinked, expectant of the hammer's fall, ears strained, anticipative of the roar. But Hugh walked leisurely across the floor and kicked the croucher, saying, "Come, get up and wag your tail. I couldn't kill a pup." Then, in the next chapter, Hugh goes looking for Jamie, Jim Bridger, who left the fort before the snows to look for Hugh and find his presumably dead body and bury it. So the final chapter occurs from Jamie's perspective, who is looking for Hugh, and he encounters a Blackfoot tribe, and among them, a man in a black robe, who is referred to as the Black Robe. Jamie is talking to this man, and he tells him of a great wrong that he's done. And then Neihardt narrates, "The big man leans above the youth. 'My son!' Grown husky with the word, the deep voice breaks, and for a little spell the whole man shakes, as with a clinging cold. 'Have faith and hope. 'Tis often nearest dawn when most we grope. Does not the good book say, who seeks shall find?' But, father, I am broken now and blind, and I have sought, and I have lost the way." To which the stranger, "What would Jesus say?" "Hark! In the silence of the heart 'tis said, by their own weakness are the feeble sped. The humblest feet are surest for the goal. The blind shall see the city of the soul. Lay down your burden at his feet tonight." So the Black Robe reveals himself to be, in fact, Hugh Glass. And we see here that there is an overtly Christian theme of forgiveness with an appeal to Jesus, reference to the book of Matthew. On the next page, there's a reference to Job. And this is in marked contrast to the novel and film version, where there is an explicitly atheistic theme. There's a scene towards the end of the movie where the antagonist, John Fitzgerald, who is this story's version of Jules Le Bon, played by Tom Hardy in the movie. Fitzgerald is sitting at a campfire telling a story about how his father wasn't a religious man, but when he was lost in the wilderness and delirious and starving, he found God. And here's a clip from the movie.
And he found religion. At that moment, he told me he found God. And it turns out that God, he's a squirrel. Yeah, big old meaty one. I found God, he used to say. While sitting and basking in the glory and the sublimity of mercy, I shot and ate that son of a bitch.
So it turns out God is nothing but a squirrel. And you see Tom Hardy gets this crazy look in his eye, and you can see just like, wow, this guy is just totally insane. And then the ending, where Hugh Glass and Fitzgerald face off, is very bleak. Spoiler alert, Fitzgerald is killed, And the movie ends with Hugh Glass DiCaprio bleeding out, looking into the camera. It seems to be implied that he's going to die, and that's the last shot of the movie. So, great movie, kind of depressing. It's very much a movie for our age that reflects our age's nihilistic values, as Neihardt's epic reflected the passing values of an earlier age. So, it's not surprising the director of The Revenant made the choices he did in adapting the novel for an audience that I'm sure would not be receptive to an ending that chooses forgiveness over revenge, like it would have been slated as a faith-based film. Critics would likely interpret such an ending as unsatisfying. Rotten Tomatoes would have given that movie a low score on the tomato meter, and DiCaprio wouldn't have gotten his Oscar. So the two different versions of the story really emphasize the cultural shift we've undergone as a nation.